Hey everybody, welcome to our virtual Bible study. If you're just tuning in, we are finishing up our lesson number 5 on the existence of God. I want to encourage you right now, if you've not viewed the previous lessons, you may want to go back and listen to some of the lessons leading up to tonight's conclusion, our finishing out of lesson number 5, so that it's joined together and makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, we're getting right into the middle of a lesson. If you're caught up, well, we welcome you tonight. We're so glad you're with us. I will encourage you, though, we archive all of these videos so you can go back and refresh your memory, get caught up on where we are. Right now, we're finishing a look at knowledge and the way that we come to know things, our use of reason, logic. That's what we're finishing up tonight. And then in our next lesson, we're going to be looking at the arguments that we're presenting, that we make for the existence of God. And we're going to be looking at the universe and what the universe tells us about the existence of God. I always think of the verse in the Bible. I realize we're arguing a lot, not from the Bible. We're using creation itself as we argue, but I always remember the verse in the Bible, Psalm 19, verse 1, the firmament shows the handiwork of God. The heavens declare his glory, right? So there are fingerprints of God in this universe. And when we go to Romans 1, verse 20, the Bible says that the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they're without excuse, meaning that no one can claim in the end that the evidence was insufficient, that it couldn't be discerned, that we just couldn't know. It's there, and if we're reasonable and honest with evidence, then that will lead us to the conclusion that there is a God in heaven, and we can even deduce from nature itself a few things about God and a few things about his nature. So we'll be talking about that beginning in the next lesson. We're gonna be talking about a big jawbreaker term, the cosmological argument. But basically it's saying for everything that you see as an effect, there has to be an adequate cause for that effect. So we're going to be looking at cause and effect and what we learn from the cause and effect relationship that exists in this universe. So we'll be taking a look at that. And I hope that will embolden us and increase our faith in the existence of God. So we'll be taking a look at that. I want to say this before we make our normal pitch about YouTube and Facebook. Well, let me do that first. If you're on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, do a couple things for us. Facebook, share the video. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe and help boost the video so that we get more visibility. We're not monetized. We're not making money off of it. This is a work of the North Hamilton Church of Christ, so that's part's taken care of. We just want more people to see it, so help us out with that. Give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the videos so that we can have more views per video and then push the content into a better spot of visibility on YouTube. Now say this. Here's what I was going to say before I switched real quick. I am not at all opposed to, in fact, I encourage interaction. If you're on YouTube, obviously you know very well there's a comment section below the video. I would like to say this. Keep it respectful and keep it clean. Okay, we've had to remove a few comments because they weren't respectful. They were clearly digs at theism, which I don't mind at all you objecting. Okay, I don't mind that at all. That's good for conversation. That there has to be a starting point, and sometimes you have to say, look, I don't agree with what you're saying, but you can be respectful about it. In the same way that I'm going to be and do my best to be respectful about atheism. I don't agree with atheism. I think it's a foolish way of thinking, and I don't mean that as against the person who believes it. I think it's not a logical position. All right, so foolish means it's unwise to take that position. We can say things like that, right? We can have disagreements, and we can talk through those disagreements, but we don't want you being ugly in the comment section. If you're ugly, we're going to remove the comment. I encourage you. If you're an atheist, we've had several. In fact, we're getting a study started with a couple where we're just going to talk. Well, I don't know what will come of it, but at least we're talking. I think that's great. Why can't we talk about things that we disagree about and look for truth, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing. Analyzing the evidence and making logical conclusions about the evidence, and I promise you, I'll go wherever the evidence leads. I'm a common sense type of guy, but I think you ought to be the same way. Be honest, and let's talk about our differences, and let's do that. We can do that reasonably. So if you have disagreements, I don't care for you to post those down there, but give us a way to contact you, right? So one of the things we don't want to do is to use the comment section as just sort of this open forum for the whole wide world. If you have disagreement, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to contact you, and we'll kick it over to private message, and we can talk about that. I would love to do that. I am not opposed to talking. I don't want you to think at all that I'm closed-minded or that we at the North Hamilton Church of Christ were closed-minded. We can be fair with evidence, so let's talk. Will you do that? So if you have a disagreement, post and say, hey, I'd love to study this, and I'll get with you and we'll talk about it. Does that sound like a good arrangement? Because I'm willing. If you're willing, I'm willing to talk about this. This is too important for us not to talk about. Because if you're an atheist, you're probably convinced that I'm propagating error in this world, that I'm pushing off something that's not true, and likely you believe we're pushing off something that's harmful to a person's mind, because to believe an untruth would be harmful, especially one like this if it's untrue. And vice versa. I believe atheism is dangerous. But let's talk about that. Can we do that? So get with me, and I promise we'll talk together. And not everybody lives in the Chattanooga area. I get that. We're on the World Wide Web. We can still converse through email. Is that fair? Let's do that. Okay, let's reason together. And I'm willing, and I can listen, and I would love to hear, and I would love to talk. So let's do that. That's my offer. But please don't say ugly stuff in the comment section, because we're going to remove that. It's not going to be allowed to stand in the comment section if you post stuff like that. Okay, and I don't want to have to remove comments. We've got one of our deacons. He's over social media. He'll take that stuff off if he sees you're being unkind or rude. But it's okay to say, I don't agree with this argument, and then we'll talk. Okay, let's talk. I want to pick up where we're at in lesson number 5. So we were talking last lesson, which is still part of lesson number 5, lesson 5A. One of the things we were talking about, and I'm going to introduce these big jaw-breaking terms again, epistemology and metaphysics. And, unless you're reading philosophy, you probably aren't ever going to really encounter those words, but you're involved in what those words mean. Epistemology has to do with basically the study of knowledge, and every one of us do that, right? Because we're talking about what do I know, how do I know what I know, and metaphysics deals with what you can know that is beyond the physical. Okay, so both of those are concerns when it comes to a knowledge of God, because we're concerned with what is real, what is reality, and how do I know what is real? Is there a way to discern it? How do I know for a fact that my conclusion about what I'm experiencing and what I'm understanding, how can I be sure of that? How can I be clear that that's real, that's reality, and I'm interpreting it correctly, okay? And then when I'm dealing with God, I'm dealing with something that is beyond the physical. I'm dealing with something that is it's knowledge that's not tangible in the sense of scientifically verifiable, but there's truth, and there's truth to be discerned. And we showed last week in one of the verses we were looking at in Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. And I realize if you're an atheist, the Bible means nothing to you. But the point we were making last week is that the reality includes more than just the physical, right? It's more than just something you can put under a microscope and look at. Scientific method, though it's important for what it can tell us about those things that can be empirically verified in this world, it's limited because it can't explain things that are beyond the physical. All right, what's inside you, your conscience, your ability to think, and your reason and your logic, those are things, God himself and the heavenly host, those are things that are beyond the physical. All right, so we're looking at both of those ideas as a part of this answering of the question, the how and the why of reality. Now, one thing we didn't get to cover last week in our video, we ran out of time. We'll probably do it again this week, but we will finish lesson number 5 because we do want to start cause and effect, cosmology, a cosmological argument next week, and take a look at that. Is it reasonable? Is it sound? Does it hold up? So I want to pick up here, and we put a peg in it where we were talking about the need for honesty in handling information. The Bible says something about a mind that is capable of discerning truth. And again, I know if you're an atheist, the Bible doesn't mean anything to you, but I was thinking of Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. And the Bible pleads with us to consider things that are noble and just and true. And so from that, we would learn that we have to be, and we should be, even if you're an atheist and don't believe the Bible, surely you think, as we approach information, that in order to discern information and handle it correctly, we would have to be honest with the information, that we would set aside bias, because bias affects the way that we handle information, that we would have to be attentive and do our best to be discerning about the things that are presented for us. And I know in that passage talks about, that we love truth, and we should. On the other hand, I read a statement in the Bible like John 8:31 and 32, where Jesus says, you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. And I think both of those sides are important when it comes to the issue of discerning reality. The mind has to be free of bias, and you have to, there has to be a purity of mind. You're setting aside preconceived ideas, and I'm doing the same, and we're talking through issues where we're trying to be fair and we're trying to be balanced in our mind. And yet at the same time, you can't have that conversation about what is real without also having the facts of reality. So there's two sides to that. We're warned, even in the Bible, we're warned against folly and lazy thinking and being gullible. None of us want to. I don't even want atheists to be gullible, right? And you shouldn't want that for me. We should want the same thing, which is we should be asking the question, what is real? And then getting to the bottom of that, finding the answer to that. In Ephesians 4, in verse 14, it was the Apostle Paul who told us to quit thinking like children and grow up in our mind. Right, and I understand there are times in the Bible we use children in the sense of simplicity or purity, and we're supposed to be like that. But Paul is warning us we can't be caught in simple thinking, right? We can't be caught in not understanding truth because we're not allowing our minds to grow and understand the truth. There's a statement in 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 and 4, where the Apostle Paul tells us and warns preachers that there are some who will sort of desensitize their minds to the truth. Their ears want to be tickled with myth and fables rather than with truth. And there's a warning in that when we're handling evidence, it might be evidence so-called, it might be evidence, but there's two sides. We have to have facts, and then the method that we evaluate those facts has to be right as well. So we're talking about content and the manner in which we handle the content. And the success depends on the type of truth we accept, right? So the content matters, which is what we're getting ready to talk about. When we talk about logic, we're going to talk about that a little bit, that you can have a sound premise, it can sound reasonable, but if the content of the premise is not true, then it's still not true. So the way you evaluate and what you're evaluating, both of those there has to be validity to both of those things. There are people who think, well, only the conclusions are important to the existence of God, right? It only matters that God exists, and the manner in which we get there doesn't matter at all. The way we argue, for example, is not nearly as important as just proving that he exists. But I feel like that's a losing battle. I feel like we're going to be on the losing end of the battle if we do that. We're not really going to be convincing people that God exists if our reasoning isn't sound, if it's not full of common sense, right? Because I think Genesis 1, 26 and 27 reminds us that when we are made in the image of God, we're made after a logical God. And I believe that we are made with logic, or the capability of assessing things logically, and good common sense. I just think we're made that way. Now, there are atheists, many of whom are professed and practicing humanists and relativists. It's in their writings. I know some of the comments we had to remove were just personal attacks. I had some say, well, have you talked to every atheist in the world? No. But I've got an entire section of my library full of hundreds, if not thousands, of books by atheists, and I've read enough to know that there are many who are humanists, relativists. They deny truth, and they still attempt to prove their side of the argument with logic. And you know why we do that? Because that's the way we're built. We're built like that. God made us all that way. And whatever you do with it, whether you become a theist or whether you choose to go against the way you're made and try to argue against God and be an atheist or relativist or to be, whatever, a skeptic or an infidel. And there are a lot of people who are probably that more so than atheists. There are a lot more professed atheists these days. But we still use logic. We say this is not because of, and if you think about this, then this. Right? Those are logical arguments. And so an atheist might say something like, well, who is God? Right? God exists. Well, who is he? Right? And as an example, you might throw out something like, Jim made the ball and bat. And so you'd say, well, who's Jim? Right? Who's Jim? Because that seems like a fair question. And somebody can point to Jim and they can identify Jim that made the ball and the bat. And so an atheist will say, see, you can't do that with God because you can't ask who is God and answer the question. There's no way to do that. And they would suggest that there's no answer to that. So it proves that there's no God. See how they would use logic, so-called, to try to argue against God, or the issue of evil and suffering. And they would say, if God is benevolent, and he allows evil and suffering in the world, he's not benevolent, therefore he's not God. That is an argument that is attempting to argue logically against the existence of God. So it's not right if in this discussion we're having to try to argue for the existence of God that our arguments don't make sense. They should make sense. In fact, I'm convinced that the Bible teaches us, and I know if you're an atheist, you shut me off right here because you're not listening to the Bible part of it, but I'm saying as a theist and one who believes in the Bible that it's the inspired Word of God. Every word of it is true. I believe that. The Bible teaches us, those of us who are Christians, that we ought to argue effectively to win the hearts of people who have obstacles in their way to Christ. That's 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 6. Our job is to take the weapon that we've been given, which is words, and effectively using words to tear down strongholds that argue against God and win their hearts over to Jesus Christ according to verse 6. That's what the Bible teaches. And we have examples of that, do we not? Jesus did it in Matthew 4. The devil comes on the scene and he tempts Jesus to give up on God and become something else. And Jesus said this and that, and what he did was logical and it was reasonable. So that's our example. We do the same thing. I understand that there is the belief that Christianity is not logical, that theism is not logical. In fact, there was a book written some years ago called Atheism, the Case Against God. And here's what the writer, George Smith, here's what he said. He goes, the conflict between Christian theism and atheism is fundamentally a confliction between faith and reason. Right? So he believes these two things are diametrically opposed to each other. On one side you have reason, on the other side you have faith. Christianity has faith, atheism has reason. That's his argument. This is, in epistemological terms, is the essence of the controversy. Reason and faith are opposites. Two mutually exclusive terms. There is no reconciliation or common ground. All right, so he thinks that Christianity or theism is not reasonable. It stands opposed to reason. He further says it is logically impossible to reconcile reason and faith. Now, I believe Smith is wrong. I believe he's wrong. And I think every one of us are built to listen to evaluate, to look at things logically and reasonably if we set aside the preconceptions and we approach it with honesty and without the bias. We can do that because it's the way we are made. We are made logical beings able to draw conclusions based on facts. That's the way that we are made. Particularly this class, I'm just going to inject this here, particularly this class is difficult for video recording because even in class, even in the live class where we have a lot of back and forth and give and take on these, it's difficult because for the 15 to 20 minutes that we're actually talking about this on video, maybe upward of 30 minutes, I'm probably skipping over 20 pages of notes, and I wish that I could go through. I wish we had all the time in the world to go through this, and we just don't. But I can go through my notes, and just in this one lesson, I've got 30 pages of notes, and with my eyes, I'm having to jump ahead and scan forward, and I apologize about that. I wish we could convey all that's in here, but I'm trying to do it in a way that makes sense and it's concise. But I think at this point, I had a bunch of illustrations, and we'll skip some of those. But I think the point is, I think we've established that when we argue with each other, against each other, however we're doing it, when we argue, we're looking at two things. We're looking at the content, right, the conclusion you're offering, and we're looking at the manner in which we argue. Right? Is the conclusion warranted by the premises? And I understand we're probably decades past when people used formal logic to make arguments, right? But we still do it. We still do it in our mind. We're still logical people. And whether we're writing out syllogisms, we're still doing that. Now, in philosophical circles, people usually fall on one side or the other. So if you go back and you look at, for example, Plato, or you look at Descartes, or some folks who are in that category, they would say something like, the ideas of reason generate only from within the mind. Right? So if you're making an argument, it's because in your mind you've sort of generated that truth. The mind is responsible for the content of knowledge, according to those people. They would say that language is of the argument is the most important consideration. The language is, and it works without much consideration to the soundness of the premises. So they would say it's just all up here. Now, if you go to another side of philosophy, you've got Hume and Locke and people on that side who believe that sense experience is the only source of knowledge. Right? So they would say language is not nearly important as the experience of knowledge. And so on that end, you would find that they would say scientific method is the only filter for understanding. Knowledge is built by experience, they would say, to empirical physical things and operations. Here's where we stand. We believe both of those are important. Right? Now, we've already said that scientific method has its limitations and that not every truth can be discerned through scientific method. All right, so understanding that, we would say both of those are important. All right, we believe in the right method. We believe in the right evidence. And only when you have the right method and the right evidence do you get sound conclusions. That's what makes for sound conclusions. Now, again, we don't argue formally like we used to do it. Right? We'd write out sometimes multi-line syllogisms, if A then B, A therefore B, we would do that kind of thing. And we do that, but without using formal logic. We understand how truth works. Here would be an example of a formal syllogism, right, where the content, the premises are sound and the conclusion is sound. It sounds something like this. All A is inside of B. all B is inside of C. Therefore, all A is inside of C. See how that works? Now, you don't have to have a formal syllogism to understand that. Because I could say, my car keys are in my right front pocket, and I'm standing in whatever building. I'm standing in the bank in downtown Chattanooga, the whatever bank in downtown Chattanooga, and I could identify the specific bank that I'm standing in. Where are my car keys? Well, if my car keys are in my pocket and the holder of the pocket is inside the bank, then the car keys are inside the bank. That's how that would work, right? So that's logic. We use deduction, and we use logic to arrive at conclusions. But if I said something like this, I would say all U.S. citizens are male. Oprah Winfrey is a U.S. citizen. Therefore, Oprah Winfrey is a male. Well, the way I'm arguing that sounds right, but the conclusion isn't right. Oprah Winfrey is a female. So how could that be wrong? It proves that the content is false, and it produces, even though syllogistically it argues like a syllogism would, if content is not true, then the conclusions are not going to be true, right? So even if an atheist or theist offers something that sounds like a really good argument, if the content is false, then the conclusion is going to be false as well. All right, I have so much more to say, but we'll put it back in here because I'm very excited to move to the next step, which is, how do you know there's a God? Okay, now that we've laid the groundwork, how do you know there's a God? How can you be sure? Right? Is it more than just wishful thinking? Because I know atheists would say you wish there was, but there's not proof of it. There's proof. I hope you'll stick around. I hope you'll engage us. If you disagree, be respectful. Okay, your comment will be allowed to stand, and if you're respectful, and we'll kick it over to private message, and I would love to talk. I promise. I'll be honest, and I'll approach the conversation with honesty, and I'll listen to what you have to say because I love truth. I love truth. We at North Hamilton, we love truth, and we want to follow truth. So we have to reason through that to get to the bottom of it, right? So if we're going to figure out what reality is, the manner in which we handle truth has to be right. What we're saying, the conclusion, it has to be right. The content and the manner, they both have to be right. Okay, so we've talked about the need for evidence, how we evaluate evidence, the kinds of evidence that's available, laying aside preconceptions, how we know what we know, and why we know what we know. I think we've laid the groundwork as much as we can with the limited time that we have, without just being overmuch. And I didn't want to do that. You want to sit down and we can go through my notes. I've got 80 pages more of everything that we've talked about. It's a fascinating subject. I love talking about God, and I hope that you would be willing to talk about it too, and to talk about Him. Because I would love to share God with you, and I'm willing to hear whatever you have to say. I promise that. I promise that I'll be reasonable and honest with you, and we'll talk about things logically and with common sense. Is that a good arrangement? Hope so. Hey, I want you to know that I love you very much, and I'm so pleased that you've tuned into this. I want you to know, even if you don't believe in Him, God loves you even more than I do. And I hope you'll come back next week when we start talking about effects we see in the world and the causes of those effects, and where that can take us if we're honest with that kind of thinking. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, lesson number 6. And please share the videos. Please give us a thumbs up and help get the message out there. Thank you guys. I'll see you next week.